Prior to the 1950s, there was no such thing as personal credit. Loans at interest only existed for major purchases like cars and homes and business loans. Everything else was paid for by cash or check at the time the transaction was made. You went out to dinner, you ate, you paid by cash or check, that was it. There were no personal credit cards. Then in 1951, Diners Club was established, which allowed a person to present their Diners Club card to a vendor at the time of a transaction. No money was exchanged, but the vendor could then give that card number to the Diners Club, who would pay them for the dinner that was charged. And then Diners Club would bill their customer, the person who had dinner and showed the card in order to have it charged, and that person would settle their account with Diners Club at the end of every month. Even still, in our phrasing today, this was more of a charge card than a credit card because there was no revolving loan, there was no interest charged. You had to pay off your full balance to Diners Club at the end of every month. But it was a convenience for someone to go out and be able to lay down their Diners Club card instead of cash or a check at the time of the meal. Even so, the Diners Club was envisioned mostly for businessmen at the time in the 1950s, and they were using it only for going out to dinner, not for any other purchases in their lives. That was the purpose of the Diners Club card. In 1959, another card you've probably heard of, American Express, issued their own charge card under the same terms. It was just a charge card that had to be paid off in full at the end of every month with no revolving credit and no interest. A few years later, in 1966, Bank of America issued what it called the Bank AmeriCard, later known as Visa, which became the first recognized credit card. The first card that you didn't have to pay back the balance in full at the end of each month, that you could keep an ongoing balance on and were charged interest monthly based on that balance. Later, another consortium of banks got together and issued their own competing credit card that at the time they called MasterCharge, now called MasterCard. And in those two entities, the credit card was born. And both could be used for more things than just going out to dinner. They could be used to purchase gasoline, to purchase things at stores. As more and more merchants signed on to the Visa and MasterCard programs, and more service providers allowed payment by credit card, people were able to charge more and more of their regular everyday expenses and then carry that balance each month, building up their credit debt and paying interest. Which brought up a question for the banks. We already know we can charge so much interest on a car loan and people will pay it, so much on a home loan, a business loan. How much interest can we charge on personal credit card loans? The answers that arose, surprise, surprise, fell within two areas. What is the moral, the reasonable, the proper amount of interest to charge on a credit card? And what can we do legally? The term usury, which usually refers to the amount of interest charged on a loan, has some dispute as far as its definition. I looked this up on Google, where the definition of usury is the illegal action or practice of lending money at unreasonably high rates of interest. Well, as you can see, that's not a very definitive definition because it opens everybody up to a different interpretation of the word unreasonably, which is clearly open to broad interpretation, especially between lender and borrower. Which leaves us kind of in a weird position where, for the purposes of this course, I'm going to have to say, just like with the debt double standard, that what is reasonable doesn't really matter. Saying something is reasonable opens up interpretation based on morality and integrity, and we're not here to debate the emotionality of charging interest, though many people get very emotional about it. We're here to debate the legality of it, because that is how your competitor in the business of settling your debt is looking at it. Your bank is not looking at the emotionality of charging interest. They are looking at the legality of it. The Cornell Law University definition, which I've shown here on their website, is that usury is interest that a lender charges a borrower above the legal rate, which opens up an even greater divide between lender and borrower when it comes to what is the proper amount of interest to charge, because there is no single federal law in the United States of America that limits how much interest a bank can charge on a loan, any loan, or a credit card loan. It is left to the individual states to set interest caps within their jurisdictions, which makes it even more difficult to determine what's reasonable because every state has a different definition of what may be reasonable and therefore a different law. Some states allow 10 to 20% as an interest rate. Some states limit it to 5%. Some states have allowed 50%. Some states have allowed 100%. Some states have no limit at all to the amount of interest that can be charged on a loan or a credit card. Logic tells me that no limit at all would be unreasonable or excessive. But again, we're not going by reasonable or opinion, we're going by the law. And if the law in a particular state says there's no cap on interest rates, well, that's where you get payday loan companies, which charge 10 or 15% a week on the money you're borrowing a few days before you get your paycheck. And for people who wind up being unable to repay that $300 or $400 loan that week or the next week, multiply it out by months or 52 weeks a year, and you start to look at 600% interest annually on that loan. Ask the payday company if they think that's excessive, and they will answer they don't care. It's legal in their state. Milton Friedman, increase profit as much as possible as long as you are playing by the rules of the game without deception or fraud. In other words, without breaking the law. Now, in practice, major banks don't charge interest that high, not because they feel themselves limited by the emotionality of it, but because they are limited by competition. As we have seen, they are all trying to increase their assets by making more loans, and one of the ways that they compete is by keeping their interest rates lower. So it's the market that's keeping their interest rates in the 8 to 35% range, not emotionality. They are still limited, however, only by the law. And as we have seen with the debt double standard, a bank does not just look at the law and say, well, that's the law, so I have to abide by it. A bank looks at the law and says, how can I change it so that it benefits me the most? So Bank of America comes out in 1966, MasterCard a few years later, the Charge Card is born. Within a decade, banks were already asking themselves this question so much: how can I charge more interest in order to profit more? That a case came before the United States Supreme Court. It was called Marquette National Bank versus First of Omaha Corporation. Prior to Marquette, consumers had some protection from banks charging as much interest as possible everywhere because of this notion that states were allowed to set their own interest rate. And at the time, the going practice was that the interest rate a bank could charge in any particular state was based on where the borrower lived. So if you happen to live in a state like California that had a lower cap on interest rates, I don't know what it was at the time in 1978, but 10, 20%, instead of a state like Delaware that had a much higher cap on interest rates, if a bank sent you a credit card, even if that bank was issued out of Philadelphia or New York or New Jersey or wherever that bank's home city was, if they sent it to you in California, they could only charge the interest that California would allow them to charge, which means banks' cards had different interest rates in every state in the country, some lower, some higher, based on the state's own usury limits. But at this point, looking to increase their profits, banks said to themselves, hey, why can't we charge the interest of the state where we are housed to everybody? Have our home state's interest rate be the basis that allows us to charge interest to a borrower instead of the borrower's home state. And this case went to the Supreme Court, and the bank's argument for it was a law from the Civil War era called the National Banking Law. And what the National Banking Law allowed in the Civil War era was for a bank who called itself a national bank only by virtue of putting the word national or the abbreviation NAT, N-A-T, as you see here in Marquette National, or even the abbreviation N-A for National Bank on their name, that they became a national bank. And this allowed banks to have certain privileges during the Civil War era, like having branches in one state and another state where a borrower could deposit in one and take money out of another branch in another state. A lot of beneficial elements to being a national bank 100 years ago. That in 1978, they said, well, hey, if I'm a national bank, I should be able to charge interest nationally instead of being limited by interest state by state. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with them. You can see here the actual text of the law that I highlighted off of the internet, which says that Omaha Bank was permitted to charge the interest of its home state of Nebraska to its Bank of America members who lived in Minnesota. So in practice, what that meant is that banks could move their headquarters to whatever state allowed them to charge the most interest, and then create a credit card and export its interest rate to every other state in the country, charging the borrowers in all of those states the interest of its home state. In essence, within the debt double standard, they changed the law to allow them to charge higher interest everywhere instead of being limited by states that would have lower interest for their home borrowers. And since there is still, to this day, no federal law that limits interest rates a bank can charge, in essence, that means there is no limit to the amount of interest a bank can charge at all. So if we already said that there's no such thing as the usury definition of reasonable interest, because banks are not operating on the basis of what's reasonable, they're operating on the basis of what's legal. And we're now saying that there is no legal limit to the charging of interest, the Cornell Law University definition of usury being what's in excess of the legal limit. It means there is no limit at all to the charging of interest, either reasonably or legally. That 1978 timeline of Marquette National Bank versus First of Omaha Corp. Now begins to make sense as we look at the history of credit cards in the United States. Just 12 years earlier, the credit card was born. And within that decade, banks were looking very, very intensely and seriously and with purpose to change or create laws that allowed them to charge as much interest as possible to this huge new crop of borrowers that were taking out credit cards for making everyday purchases in their lives. Now, I don't know about you, but when I took high school civics, I saw the Supreme Court as this entity that ruled on civil rights issues and humanity and freedom. And while I figured they also made rulings on business issues, logic, or maybe emotion, or maybe just sheer fanciful desire, told me that in these cases, they would see something like a reasonable interest rate cap to protect individuals in the world of borrowing now that credit cards were new. Call it 50%, I don't know, something that at least gave a framework within which banks had to operate. Nope. They basically nullified states' ability to set their own usury limits, making it possible for any bank to charge any level of interest on a loan that it wanted to in any state, limited only by the competition of the marketplace, of which we have seen competition has allowed the rates to go up and up and up to 29, 35, 36%. On credit cards, 600%. On payday loans, the Supreme Court of the United States did not rule in your favor. It ruled in the favor of the banks. And if banks and the Supreme Court of the United States can operate on the debt double standard, individual state governments realized that they could as well. So in the 1980s, the state of Delaware, looking to increase its own profits as an entity, decided to remove all caps on interest rate charges for banks that had their headquarters in the state of Delaware. And in doing that, attracted many large national banks, Citi, Chase, and others, to come house themselves in Delaware by promising these banks that they could now export whatever interest rate they chose to every state in the country under the Marquette ruling, thereby earning the state not only the business that they brought there, but the taxes based on the business that they brought there, even though they also lowered those taxes quite a bit in order to get that business. And it didn't stop there. Over the 50 years since, banks and consortiums of banks have gone to state legislatures and the federal legislature to lobby Congress never to put a national limit on interest rates. And again, and you may be surprised by me saying this after hearing me deliver the history of banking and money and credit, I don't fault them for this. I don't. They are pursuing their best interests under the law. I get there's a double standard. They have the ability to lobby legislatures to change the law in their favor that we don't often have. But even so, if they're playing by Milton Friedman's rules of the game, if they are not breaking the law through fraud or deception to do it, they have the right to change laws and create laws, and right now legally to charge as much interest as they want on credit cards. My argument always is and continues to be that if your competitor in this situation, your bank, is going to use the law in its favor in every aspect in order to charge you as much as it can in interest and fees, up to and including going to the Supreme Court of the United States to use a 100-year-old law in its favor, that you, as an individual and the CEO of the corporation of you, have just as much right to use every single law that exists on the books that favor and protect you as a borrower.